everybody. I'm Chris Nemechek. I'm the director of the Center for the Liberal Arts, and welcome to our second of our Call 300 visitors this semester, all talking about the theme of movement and migration, and no doubt touching on that theme in different ways in terms of the connections are different depending on the classes you're taking. So we've had, right now we have the Poll Everywhere link up, but we've had the slide cycling so that you can be reminded of all of the different classes that are taking a Call 300 this semester. And we know that different classes will get different things out of each of these visitors' talks, but we also know that you'll all be able to get something valuable out of each of them. So I'm going to turn things over to our panelists here, and I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves. Iyabo, if you want to start off, and then we're going to leave the Poll Everywhere address up here. Once our introductions and so forth are done, I'm going to open up the poll, and you can feel free to just send in questions. What I will do is I will try to group like questions, so you may not hear your exact question wording, but I'm going through them and taking them as they're coming in. So please do have those questions ready. Yeah.
My name is Iyabo Ishiapim, and I am faculty in Africana Studies and Linguistics. And I'll let AJ introduce himself.
I'm AJ. I'm a junior at the college. I'm studying government and global studies with a concentration in global studies. It's nice to meet everybody.
And I am introducing Professor Michael Gomez, and I'll give you his official title, and then I'll tell you a little bit about him. So he is the Silver Professor of History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at NYU. And silver is the name, not the age, right? Right. Okay. So he's the silver, so he has an endowed chair position at NYU, and he is the director of the newly established Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. And this is one of the reasons why we invited him this year, is because he is the founding director of ASWAD, which is the Association for the Worldwide Study of the African Diaspora. And I am sure you are familiar with the signs that you've seen on campus and all of the announcements, but that conference is going on right now at the Williamsburg Lodge, and we have about 1,000 people in town attending the conference. So as you know, this semester, the Call 300 is about movement and migration. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I became interested in Mike Gomez's work. So I do linguistics, and I study the Caribbean. I am not a historian. I just want to make sure that is clear. Anyone who's taken my class knows that. I am married to a historian. So early on, when I was planning one of my courses, I really needed to have a better idea of the African diaspora. And my husband got tired of me asking me questions. This was about 12, 15 years ago. He handed me a book, and happened to be your book. I'm not exactly sure which one, but I think it was Reversing Sail, right? So that was about 10 years ago, right? But it had a lot of information in it, right? So it had a ton of stuff. So I got sucked in, and then I ended up going to a conference maybe about 10 years ago in Dominican Republic, 10 years ago. Yeah. And keep in mind, I've had this book, Reversing Sail, and a couple of his other books, and I thought of him as just like the most impressive person who studied the African diaspora. And he made it seem so real and accessible, and the details in the book, I'm sure many of you guys have been introduced to his work. And then I met him at this conference, and talking about fangirling, I don't know if you remember that moment when I got a little kind of excited when I met you that first time?
I do not remember.
Okay, well, I was a bit embarrassed later about it, but I had been using his book so often in my class, and all my students knew who he was. So anyway, a couple of years later, we decided to invite ASWAD, the conference here, and this must have been about 2.5 years ago. And this conference has a biannual event, and usually it's in a pretty impressive place, like Spain, like Dominican Republic, and Williamsburg. So we proposed to the CLA that we would have a theme on migration, movement and migration. And we picked this theme largely because ASWAD, the conference that's going on now, was brought here because of 1619. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with 1619, when the first 20 and odd Africans were brought into, ultimately, Jamestown. So we really thought about movements and migrations of people, well, whether voluntary or involuntary. And Professor Gomez was the ideal choice, largely because he is the person who conceived of ASWAD in Jamestown. You can tell us the story, hopefully shortly, about 20 years ago, right? So it seemed like the theme, movement and migration, and Professor Gomez's work would just go so well together. And so that's how that kind of started. And so Professor Gomez, could you tell us a little bit about how you started ASWAD and what were you thinking when it came into development?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And first of all, I want to thank the College of William and Mary for your invitation, your gracious invitation and hospitality. I've enjoyed my few days here thus far, and I'm sure that I will continue to do so. You have a lovely campus, and Colonial Williamsburg. Quite an attraction. I've enjoyed jogging down the street behind the horses. And, so it's been a treat. So, am I going to be okay? All right. So I want to thank the college. I want to thank the administrators, professors, and those who allowed me to come into your classrooms thus far, and I'm looking forward to continuing the same tomorrow. So the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora we began to think about it seriously about 3 or 4 years, about 1996, 1997. This was a moment in which there was beginning to develop a kind of critical mass of intellectual studies, intellectual endeavor as it pertains to the African diaspora, or Black Atlantic as it is sometimes also referred to. And we felt that it was important to begin to create a space within which scholars who work on the African diaspora could, in fact, begin to meet on a regular basis and share cutting-edge scholarship. Because prior to the establishment of ASWAD in I think that the Articles of Incorporation in New York State will give the date of 1999, but, I'm having a different, so should I turn this off? He'll mute it. He'll mute it, okay. My apologies. Bless you. Yeah, so, but our first conference was in 2000 in New York City. And so that was the general idea, was to begin to try and organize a regular meeting of scholars working on the African diaspora, because prior to that time, scholars who were interested in diasporic work as it pertained to Africa, people of African descent, didn't really have a place to do that. The professional organizations tend to be regionally organized, such as the African Studies Association, the American Historical Association. I'm more familiar with historical associations because I'm a historian. And so, but they were all focused on a region or the nation state or some such thing. The African diaspora is a different kind of paradigm in that conceptually what it seeks to do is to relate parallel as well as divergent experiences of African descended people around the globe. And so that is to say that there have been historically these experiences that have both been similar and dissimilar, and to put them into a comparative kind of framework to try to understand it. So that kind of work reveals aspects of this kind of global Black experience that a focus on, for example, simply African American history does not. And so the idea is to complement regional histories with kind of this transnational approach. And it was also, I think, theoretically kind of informed by the various iterations of the analyst school of thought. These were French and other historians who came to the conclusion that, in fact, it was much more useful to understand the Mediterranean as a whole as opposed to kind of discrete parts of the Mediterranean on either side, north or south of it. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what inspired that movement toward establishing ASWAD.
Can I ask a follow-up question there?
Me?
From the story that I heard, and this may be now an urban legend, weren't you at Jamestown when you first started to think of, didn't you attend a conference at Jamestown?
Well, now you're talking about some interesting, yeah, so that's very interesting because, in fact, I was in Jamestown. And it was for the launch of what was then referred to as the W.B. Du Bois database. And that is an online compilation of data on transatlantic slave voyages, which I believe now is up to about 36,000. And we met at, I believe it was the Alejandro Institute, if I'm not mistaken, but we were in the Jamestown area. And so that was certainly part of the impetus for moving forward with this organization. So you did mention, so we've met in various places. We started in New York, and then the next meeting was in Evanston, Illinois, at Northwestern University, from which we moved to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Then we met in Barbados. Then we met in Accra, Ghana, and then we met in then I think we may have met in Charleston.
And
then
New Orleans. Wasn't New Orleans?
No, we haven't accomplished that. We have endeavored to meet in New Orleans. We have yet to meet in New Orleans. We met in Dominican Republic, and the last meeting was in Sevilla. So we wanted to, Spain. So we wanted to meet here in this place in commemoration of the 400th year of the landing of the 20-plus Africans in Hampton, Virginia, a number of whom would go upriver to Jamestown.
Mm-hmm. Okay, could you tell us a little bit about your experience? I know that you were the president of the UNESCO International Scientific Committee for the Slave Route Project.
Yes.
Could you tell us about what that was about and your experiences there?
Yes, the United Nations, the UNESCO has developed or established a systematic study of important sites of the transatlantic trade, and to a lesser extent, trans-Saharan Red Sea and Indian Ocean trades. And so that work involves going into countries, identifying what the important sites are, and assigning them a particular kind of status. And the statuses range from a site of interest to a kind of iconic site that, historical site that has UN protection and into which the UN may invest money and so forth to preserve it or to renovate the place. And so the work involved identifying those sites as well as educating high school and college students and so forth, preparing educational materials. We developed educational materials in English and French and Spanish and Portuguese. There may be another language which details the slave trade it tends to focus on the transatlantic trade. And so that was, I was president of that for a couple of years. I continued on the committee for several more years. My understanding is that the committee continues. It ran into a funding issue because the United States at one point pulled out of funding UNESCO over a political issue pertaining to the Middle East. And so it did suffer, the work did suffer. But my understanding is that it continues on. Yeah.
And AJ, feel free to jump in if you have a
Could
question.
you talk about how your work with UNESCO impacted the overall dialogue of the transatlantic slave trade and stuff like that?
Well, what I would say is that the committee, the scientific committee as a whole, has had an impact in developing these curricular materials. We've had a number of different fora across the planet, inviting persons such as yourselves to meetings and conferences and so forth. The scientific committee has also partnered with cultural organizations as well as state institutions for the purpose of disseminating information with regard to the slave trade. The most recent large project of which I am aware was the one that established, we commissioned a sculpture commemorating the transatlantic trade, which is on the grounds of the United Nations. And it was a blind competition. That is to say, we didn't know, we had a number of different contestants. We didn't know who they were, where they came from, and so forth, but we just looked at the mock-ups and we made a determination. As it turns out, the person who won the competition was a Haitian sculptor. And so it's a beautiful memorial. So when the next time you're in New York, you come to the United Nations, it's right there for all to see. Yeah, so it has impacted, but not to the extent that I would have liked for it to have impacted the pedagogy and the curricular aspects of both not only education at the college level, but at the university level, but also at the secondary school level. Mm-hmm. And I always wanted to see an intensification of materials. I wanted the UNESCO committee to produce more materials in these various languages that we could disseminate really throughout the world, because there's a tremendous interest in this experience, in this diasporic experience, and many people don't know much about it at all. And so, and for example, there are countries that actually legislate, a need for, education in the field of Black-related, diasporic-related studies, and there's a need for materials, and sometimes that need is not met by really high-end quality materials, and so that's something that regrettably I did not get accomplished, but we just simply didn't have the funds to make that happen. I would, it would be wonderful if ASWAD could kind of step into that breach, but it takes a lot of money, and to accomplish that.
I have some questions that are coming in from the audience, so feel free to add more. So I have one that's I think, a pretty quick answer, but might be occurring to many people here. How do I join ASWAD or get involved with the program?
So you just go across the street to the Williamsburg Lodge and sign up.
Literally.
Yes. But you can also go online. It's www.aswad.org, and it's very, very simple, very easy to join.
And I do want to ask, and maybe you can talk about this, one of the things that I find wonderful about ASWAD, it is not only academics. So we tend to find a lot of conferences that are exclusive to people with PhDs and people who do research. And the times that I've attended ASWAD, you see all sorts of people there. People with interest, people, people who do their own research at home. And I think it's an engaging organization for that reason. Was that the intention when you?
That was the intention.
Okay.
You hit the nail on the head. We wanted to bring in a variety of cultural workers, including people in the professoriate, but also non-academics, activists, students, just common people who would be interested in the subject. And so everyone is welcome to participate and to join. The membership spans the globe. That was the other thing I wanted to raise. Because one of the things that we wanted to do in the African diaspora is to not simply talk about the Atlantic, that is to say, talk about, so a couple of things. One, we wanted to certainly engage Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean, very, very important. But we also wanted to expand the conversation to include the so-called Middle East and the Indian Ocean and so forth, because there is a considerable African presence in these places as well, and to try to get into some comparative analysis of how these experiences converge and diverge. But the other thing, too, I was trained as an Africanist, lived for some time in Senegal and in Mali, and so I have a certain kind of orientation to this material. And I am particularly invested in understanding the ways in which these populations who live outside of Africa connect with or do not connect with the African continent, politically, culturally, socially, and so forth. And so that's one of the things that ASWAD does. And so, even as we speak, it's very interesting because we're beginning to see more and more scholars, activists, others who are primarily concerned with Africa beginning to participate in ASWAD. So it's great.
Mm-hmm. So, go
I'll
ahead.
take one and then we'll come back. What encouraged you or encouraged your interest in Islamic studies?
Yeah, this question came up in a class yesterday. It was really quite by accident. I started school as an undergraduate as a chemistry major.
Uh-oh.
I loved chemistry, but I liked history more, and decided that around my junior year that it was time to kind of pursue my own interest as opposed to what had been determined for me by my family to become a doctor.
You did become a doctor.
I did become a doctor of sorts. Indeed, I did. So I completed the bachelor's degree in U.S. history, and with an interest in the South, and realized at that point that I knew absolutely nothing about Africa. I had never taken a course on African history, African political science, African anthropology, nothing. I knew nothing about Africa. And so I determined to remedy that particular problem with a master's degree in African history. So I did the master's degree in African history, and in the process decided to take a course on Islamic civilization. And this was at the University of Chicago, and Chicago had developed quite a reputation for this field. And so this is an interesting story. I think some of you will benefit from this. So, Chicago is on quarters. And so I think the second quarter of this 3-quarter sequence on Islamic civilization, I decided to write a paper on early West Africa. So I focused on Ghana, Mali, Songhai, the 3 great states, about which my most recent book is concerned. And so wrote the paper, and the TA, teaching assistant, read the paper, gave me a C- for the paper.
This has never happened to
Ever.
Never happened to you, I'm sure, but it gave me a C- for the paper and said that because the paper discussed Islam. And the thesis of the paper was that, in fact, Islam had some importance in West Africa, in early medieval West Africa. And so the TA, who apparently knew nothing about West Africa, returned the paper to me with a C- and said that he found the project highly dubious because Islam had no role in West Africa. Well, for some reason, the professor in the class decided to read the paper. And he gave me an A-, and said, this is actually a very good paper. But he said, if you are serious about this, you're going to have to learn Arabic. So I said, okay. So I started studying Arabic. And one thing led to another, and I became aware of the fact that Islam was, in fact, a very important theme in West Africa, as well as North Africa, East Africa. And so that's how it developed.
I think oftentimes our perspective when we're looking back at that in our lives is very different than in advising college students, I'm sure some of you have found yourself in this position where I want to know what I'm going to do and I want to know the steps to get there. And so much of, academic lives as well as personal lives are just taking that roundabout path.
No, I stumbled and then realized, oh, this is what I need to do. I really enjoy this. The plan was to get a master's degree in African history and in computer science.
Your regular
Because I needed a
traditional
job,
master's
right?
degree combination
You
there,
needed
yeah.
something you could make an earning with. So, but didn't work out that way. I know nothing about computer science.
So I'm interested in how you approach field work when you're out in the field, or maybe you can tell us one of your most memorable field work experiences that really affected the way you do work, or what you discovered as you did some of this field work. So while reading some of your books, you have so much information in there that you clearly have spent a ton of time out in the world.
Probably one of the most memorable experiences I had was when I was initially doing ethnographic work in eastern Senegal on the border with Mali. And I was interviewing an elderly individual in this village to the south of a town called Bakel. And came to find out, it dawned on me after a couple of days that this individual was a little deranged. And that I was getting this information from someone who was not quite there. Yeah, that was the most memorable experience. So, I interviewed a whole lot of people. My methodology it depends upon the project. The initial project was on 18th and 19th century West Africa in what is now Senegal. And so it draws upon some Arabic documentation, but for the most part, French documentation as well as interviews that I conducted in the field. that was one of the more memorable ones. That helped me to identify who exactly in the society, who in these communities actually had knowledge. So that was funny. I still have the tapes of that interview, actually. Yeah. But for the more recent research on medieval West Africa, which resulted in this book, African Dominion, I spent time in northern Mali, and this was in the manuscript collections in places like Timbuktu and Jinni and so forth. You may or may not know about this, but prior to the trouble with the jihadists, who are now creating havoc across the whole of the West African Sahel, there was quite a serious project of manuscript collection taking place in West Africa. And the manuscripts are all written in Arabic script. Most of them are, in fact, in the Arabic language, but a percentage are in Arabic script but written in West African languages. This is referred to as Ajami. And so, but there are thousands and thousands of these manuscripts. Some of them go back, some of them are very, very early in Timbuktu and Jinni and so forth. We have examples of Qur'ans which go back to the 12th century of the Common Era. And so it's here you have in West Africa libraries. In Timbuktu alone, there were at least 27 private libraries, as well as the parastatal, the Ahmed Baba Institute, which was run by the state. And so the Ahmed Baba Center was largely left alone by the jihadists who came in and took over Timbuktu for a period of time. But there are thousands and thousands of manuscripts alone there, but the total number, it was really quite extraordinary. And the West has very little understanding of this, but we're talking about a highly literate West African society, and which left records. And so it was quite an experience, and there's so much more to do. Some people have tried to calculate the number of manuscripts in West Africa. I don't know how they do that, because for a long time, the families held these manuscripts in, steel containers and so forth, and they had them in their homes and so forth, or during the period of colonial expansion, they would hide these manuscripts beneath the earth in the desert or elsewhere, trying to keep them out of colonial hands. And so the families were the living repositories of these documents. And so what happened was, from the 1980s forward, there was a project by which the families were encouraged to turn over these manuscripts to the state or to these private libraries. And they were collected in these major cities like Timbuktu and Jinni, Gao to a lesser extent, and other towns. And so it was with great difficulty that the families parted with these manuscripts, and then lo and behold, you have this difficulty with this jihadic activity, and so a lot of these manuscripts were put into jeopardy. Some of them were burned, but as it turns out, Most were preserved. Some of them were taken south to Bamako and so forth, but this is just a small sliver of a very large, endeavor with respect to religion, education, history, philosophy. There are works on astronomy, there are works on medicine, there are legal texts. It's just a range of material in these places. So, yeah, and there's been some documentation, some discussion of this in the United States and Europe, but for the most part, it's still something about which people know very little. But it was a major, and a lot of funding went into it. The Ford Foundation, a number of European countries funded the process, and South Africa also funded some of the work. And I could go on and on about this, but I mean, it was really, really just fascinating to see what was happening with respect to these very old manuscripts being repaired and being cataloged and digitized, and really amazing. So, and it's one of the, I felt that it was probably one of the most important projects in the world as we concluded the end of the 20th century. So we'll see if, that can restart as we move forward. But right now the region is very fragile. It's very fragile. And so, don't know what's going to happen.
So I've got some really great questions, so thank you for those. One of them kind of dovetails off.
You need to just stop me because I can just go on and on.
Okay, I will I'll throw up a hand or something. I'm trying to group them. There are some themes that are emerging here. But there's a couple questions about the extent to which the intellectual space on the African diaspora, and I'm just thinking about the way in which you're talking about the funding for these various manuscripts and so forth. The question is the extent to which the intellectual space on African diaspora reflects existing power dynamics, who gets funded, who gets published, who gets cited, all.
That's an excellent question. Wow, that's an excellent question. It very much reflects the geopolitics with which we are engaged. It is a process, quite frankly, in which the American Academy is privileged. That's something that we will need to address. However, it's not simply an issue with diaspora, but it also has to do with, I think, African studies as well. That is to say that given the difficulties of a number of African countries with respect to their budgets and so forth and so on, it is often the case that university is one of the areas that suffers as a consequence of some of these budgetary constraints. And so scholars who are living in the continent often, they don't have the resources that you have in the United States, don't necessarily have access to the material, certainly the money, the funding, and so forth and so on. So this is a very difficult situation. And it is something about which I know the African Studies Association is trying to address, but so much more needs to be done because there's a lot of intellectual activity in the continent, a lot of brilliant, brilliant people. But as a consequence of that, you do have a lot of activity on Africa in this place, in the United States and as well as in Canada. And this kind of gets into a kind of a political issue, and I'm not so sure how far to pursue this, but So maybe I'll just curtail it by saying that that the geopolitics, the global geopolitics, very much influences who gets funding and who does not get funding, and the direction of the studies and so forth. Yes.
Do you perhaps see ASWAD as potentially growing into being an organization that can help spread that wealth and incorporate that global mindset? Or?
Well, it's a possibility, ASWAD, the thing about ASWAD, which is really beautiful, but also limiting, is that the organization was founded with the intentionality of not being reliant on external funding. For a variety of reasons. So consequently, all of the work that has gone on in ASWAD for the past 20 years has been voluntary. Everything is voluntary, which is unbelievable because everybody has a life, people have families, people are in the academy, people are trying to get tenure, promotion, writing books, they have things to do. So it's really been a labor of love, but I think that the question that you're asking, AJ, is something that, the president and future leadership of ASWAD will have to address. That is to say, to what extent ASWAD wants to get involved in trying to promote the study of diaspora in Africa in ways that better support scholars, colleagues who are not based in the global north. Yeah. So one of the things that we've done at the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora at New York University is we have started a fellowship, a postdoc, that specifically targets scholars who are in the global south. And so we just started that this year.
Could you explain what the Global South means to?
Well, basically, we're talking about, it kind of maps onto those regions and countries which were subjected to forces of colonialism and imperialism. We're talking about Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You have more questions?
I do. So we've gotten several questions about sort of the problematic narratives, whether that's that you have found and sort of the most common problematic narratives about the African diaspora. A couple of students have asked about that with respect to sort of what's in primary and secondary education in the United States, but also sort of inside and outside of academia.
So let me answer that question with a personal anecdote. When I was in high school, I grew up in Chicago, and I went to Catholic school. Was forced to go to Catholic school, and so high school, Catholic high school, and it was very interesting because I had spent some time in elementary school in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, and came to Chicago, back to Chicago. I was born in Chicago, spent some time in St. Thomas, came back to Chicago, and because I came out of the Caribbean, I was put in the kind of slow class in this school. So I had to kind of work my way into the honors program here, but it took a couple of years because the assumption was that I'd come out of I was poorly educated. It was interesting. At any rate, there was a session where several of the class leaders were asked. It was on a dais very similar to this. There were several of us. And there were a lot of people in the audience, like you, but they were secondary school teachers and so forth. And the question emerged, the question came about concerning our backgrounds. And so I was the only African descendant student on the stage. And the question began, I was the last person to answer the question. So it began over here, and it eventually made its way to me. So the question was, what's your background? And so one student, I'm German, the other one, I'm Irish, I'm Jewish, I'm this and that, and so forth and so on. And it came to me. And that was a moment, because all I could say was, well, I'm black. I can't tell you anything else. That was a very powerful moment. I never forgot it. I never forgot that moment. And I think that had something to do with my determination to find out more about where I came from. And yeah. And so that was important because it started a journey through which I began to understand that the African American experience, the African American or the Afro-Latinx experience did not begin on slave ships. Our experience, our history does not begin in slavery. It does not. And that it becomes important to understand, the African antecedent, the African cultural background, the African social political background, that people came from societies, they came from communities, they had religious beliefs, they practiced certain kinds of agriculture, they knew metallurgy, some lived in cities, some lived in towns. It was a diverse kind of thing that, it wasn't a situation where Africans were simply swinging from trees until Europeans arrived. But and so that's a problem, because let me just say this to you. I have students just like you, and I teach a course, a large lecture hall with students. I have like 120 students and so forth in the room, and I've been doing this now for a while. I've been teaching for a while, and 34 years. And it never fails that a good percentage of the students come into the class with stereotypic notions about Africa, Africans, black people, and they will leave that class. And those ideas will not be challenged. Doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter what I ask them to read, it doesn't matter. And what that teaches me is that it's not just the curriculum. It is the kind of total ambiance of life in the United States, in which all of us are bombarded with certain kinds of ideas about black people, about Africans, about Africa, and so forth and so on. And it's just simply easier to believe these things than to really learn something about who these people are. And it's a tragic thing. Now, a number of people will learn some things, and that's good. But invariably, these ideas are very, very difficult to dislodge. It's very, very difficult to dislodge. I have students who come into class who believe that all Africans went around naked before the slave trade. People, that people didn't know anything about clothes or shoes. It's just unbelievable. Yeah. So hopefully this is an opportunity for you to, your university to learn some things. I was just talking about literacy. And that's an idea that Westerners have difficulty latching on to, but that prior to slave trades, colonialism, imperialism, many Africans were already literate. and we're engaged in all kinds of studies. So, you know, the evidence is there. You know, it's,
Do you have some ideas about how we break through? How do we dismantle those?
well, it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing. I do believe, though, that as we push the educational envelope, as more and more people like this, I applaud William and Mary for having this conceptual framework within which to explore these ideas. And I would encourage you to take them very seriously and take the opportunity to actually learn and to allow the educational experience to actually challenge your assumptions. And my position in my classes, I'm not trying to convert anybody. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. And my position is that at the end of the class, you should be able to present an argument for your position and to marshal the evidence, to marshal the data to support your position, whatever the position is. And so I'm very interested in, so yes, I am interested in both you know, the process of developing critical thinkers. I am concerned that you know, sometimes, you know, it's just not getting through. But you know, this is all, you know, the educational process is very much connected to you know, our politics and socioeconomic realities, and I understand that.
Let me just follow up really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Michael, you mentioned that the story about being in school and just saying that you're black. How would you answer that question now?
Well, the immediate journey begins with, and it connects to this whole migration business because I am the child of immigrants. My mother's family is from Mississippi. Her parents are from Mississippi, from Vicksburg and Mound Bayou. They will migrate to Chicago during the Great Migration, so they experience that. They understand what that's all about. My father was born in Puerto Rico. He's a Criollo, and he fought in the Korean War, came out with a Purple Heart, met my mother in Chicago, and here I am. And so spent a lot of time in Mississippi, spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico. I would say that I'm an African who happens to be in America. And I can explain that answer, but that has been a process. Yeah, it's been a process of discovery.
Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's still, we're sort of, I think actually a follow-up to our previous question is, what recommendations do you have for institutions like William & Mary who don't require students to take African diaspora-related courses?
Well, you know, this is the thing. This is the thing. And I was talking about this in a class yesterday, so for those of you who heard this, forgive me. But I think it's a good answer. And that is to say that I think it's important for American society as a whole to just kind of make a decision as to who we're going to be. Are we going to be heterogeneous and pluralistic or not? And if we're going to be heterogeneous, that is to say, if we're going to be a complex society, then we need to learn about the components of the society. And we need to begin to learn that from elementary school through college. And so we need to, so we're here in colonial Williamsburg. This is an important part of that history. We need to certainly honor that history, but at the same time understand that the history evolves and moves on. There were important components of even Williamsburg and the early colonial history that needs to be incorporated into the general story, but also even subsequent stories need to be incorporated into that. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, you know? I don't know the answer to whether things should be mandated and what should be mandated. But I do think that we should have a conversation at the collegiate level, at the university level, as to what constitutes American society, and how can, and with that answer, how can we facilitate educating young people to understand, you know, how to engage with that society, because this is the place where you need to learn how to do that, but even before. Yeah, because I mean, we're not, and I'm not addressing William and Mary, but just the country as a whole. I don't think that we're preparing our young people to engage in a level of citizenship that is the most beneficial. And but we've got to kind of make a decision about who we are as an American society. And if we are a mosaic, then let's be a mosaic. And that will require some redirection, and that will require some re-education. But at the end of the day, at the end of that process, I think we'll be a far better educated population, a much more capable citizenry, and a number of the issues with which we are confronted will be effectively addressed.
No, that forward, yeah, I'm good right now. That just saying that you had asked me before we got onto the stage where I was from, and I remember I answered Virginia because my ancestors were slaves. Actually, probably some of them were at the college or in Williamsburg, but very close to Richmond. And kind of digressing and going back to that point, I guess I do have a question, is that do you see that lack of knowledge of a cultural identity as a prevalent problem for just African Americans, anyone affected by the diaspora, or so forth? What do you think?
I think this is an important question, AJ, and I think that it's something that we have to, my approach, and I'm not saying that it's the best approach, although I do think it's the best approach, but my strong feeling is that we have to connect the African American, African Caribbean, Afro-Latinx experience with the African antecedent. Mm-hmm. And there's everything right about that, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing, I mean, you know, I shouldn't even, I don't even have to defend it. I mean, people are of German ancestry, Irish ancestry, Scottish ancestry, so I'm very proud of that. Some of you can connect to the towns and the villages from which your families come. That's great. You should be able to do that. And you should be able to do that. And because that's who you are. That's where you come from. And so I think that the African connection is very, very important. I think that's the key. I think that we now call ourselves in this country African Americans. I'm not sure that most or many African Americans have thoroughly interrogated that to get, wrap their heads around, well, what does that really mean? So It's, you know, so, I mean, it's a personal kind of journey. It's a familial journey. I've tried to do some work to address that at the aggregate level with respect to understanding the different African populations that come into a place like the United States, or what becomes the United States, and so forth. And so more work is being done, you know, to kind of uncover that. And so, you know, we're trying to make some progress. You know, we're trying to make some progress.
You have questions? So I just wanted to follow up on that. One of the things that occurs in my class all the time, a conversation that I have with my students, is this concept of the Black identity. And whether there is, and my work is in the Caribbean, and my family is from Bermuda. And I will be honest, it is really hard talking about a Black identity or an African identity. And I'm wondering, for places like Dominican Republic, where Black is a problematic word, right? Can you talk about some of your experiences working there?
This is the thing. Thank you so much for that question. And it's a delicate question. It identifies the extent to which, you know, the so-called Black identity has been in motion. It has been in evolution. It is complicated by issues of class and status. And I would say this. I would say that I don't think the evidence is there for a Black identity, quote unquote. I think that there are multiple Black identities. I think that Blackness travels differently depending upon what society we find ourselves in. I was talking about this in one of the classes the other day. So that my sense of who I am as an African American or Puerto Riqueño or both is not necessarily the same as someone who is Afro-Cubano or Afro-Brazilian or you know, it's a different, it depends upon where you are. And so I think what we have to do in that situation is to listen to each other to get a sense of how Blackness may differ, you know, depending upon the locale, depending upon the country. And also, I think that we have to come to grips with, and this is why I go back to County Cullen's poem, What is Africa to Me? Because I think it is something that is at the center of the Black identity, and we can either engage it or deny it. And for so many people, for so long, the process was to deny it and to create distance between ourselves and the New World and Africa. Because, and the reason for that is because, you know, we were taught that Africa was something about which we should be ashamed, that Africa was a savage place, it was a barbaric place, it was an uncivilized place. Why would you want to be associated with Africa? And so consequently, there has been that struggle to create that distance. But then, you know, over a period of time, people began to slowly begin to say, well, let's take another look at that. And so it's been a process. It's been a process, and it's ongoing. It will continue. And so we'll see how it works out. I also would say that it's perfectly fine to not simply be one thing. I think that's perfectly fine. I could be wrong. But we, you know, our societies are becoming more and more complex. There are individuals in the room who are multiracial. Some of you, are headed for some very interesting relationships. And, it will be, so things are becoming more and more complex, with respect to African, European, Asian, Native American ancestries. And it's okay to be more than one thing. And because we are more than one thing. We identify ethnically, racially, we identify with respect to a particular community of faith or not. We have gender identities, identities of sexual preference, regional identities, Southerners, Northerners, Midwesterners. We have all of these identities. How we arrange them is your individual business. If you arrange them in a sort of hierarchy and so forth. But I mean, it's perfectly fine to be and to embrace multiple identities, in my opinion.
You have some questions?
I do, and there's one that's come in a variety of ways, so I'll ask that one. How does the diaspora relate or impact the current state of development within sub-Saharan Africa? And there's also been questions sort of historically, what has that impact been of the African diaspora? And there's also been a question about the specifically economic impact. So there are several.
Well, this is something that we are beginning to understand better and better. That is to say that we know about the flow of African people, African culture into the Americas, but it was not simply a unidirectional flow. And so what we're beginning to understand now is the ways in which individuals and communities who found themselves in the Americas reversed sail and went back and impacted, in particular, West African societies. And so we know about Sierra Leone, we know about Liberia, but also Africans would go back to what becomes Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, and would impact, at least in some of the urban areas, the early development of places like Lagos and so forth. So you have had that kind of reverse flow. Then I think as well, the whole idea of Pan-Africanism is something that arguably also flowed from the Americas to Africa. And so many of the early Pan-Africanists were people who were born in the Americas who had ideas about Africa and so forth, Alexander Crummell and Edward Blyden and Henry Highland Garnett and so forth. And then you had people Africans who would go on to be heads of state, who would study in the United States and would be influenced by these ideas. And so you had people like Kwame Nkrumah, Ezekwe, who would become the presidents of Ghana or prime ministers of Ghana and Nigeria, independent Ghana and Nigeria respectively, who studied in the United States, and they studied the ideas of Garvey and so forth, and were very, very influenced by these ideas. So there has been a back and forth over the centuries. If I understand the question, historically, yeah. So I don't know if the question has to do with, because this question came up in another class yesterday about the impact of the slave trade on Africa, and I don't know if that's what the question is or not.
That could be underlying it. Like I said, there are a couple of different ones. I think you've hit on it
good.
pretty well.
Good.
And we're coming up on time, so
I have one more
I was
question.
going to say, how about
Okay.
a last question?
So my question, since most of the
This
people,
is going well. I was intimidated.
you were intimidated?
Yeah.
As accomplished as you are?
Yeah.
You were intimidated? See? Everybody gets intimidated. My question is, for all the students and non-students in the room, if you could recommend one book, could be your own or otherwise.
Yeah, I would recommend,
Yeah.
recommend my own book.
Your own book?
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Or a film?
I'm just kidding.
Or
I'm
somewhere.
just kidding.
What
Yeah.
book would you want everybody in here to read?
Marquez. You should read Marquez.
And the title?
Is it Death in the Time of Cholera?
Love in the Time of
Love in the
Cholera.
Time of Cholera. You should
Why
read
that
it.
book?
It's wonderful. It is one of the most amazing books. All of his work is amazing because it engages the imagination in a way that allows us to understand that we can forward. We can overcome boundaries. We can, that they're not necessarily limits to the ways in which we can think innovatively and creatively. I think it inspires creativity, innovation, and I like to see that in students. Because I think it would encourage you to think about thinking differently, thinking outside of the box, thinking unconventionally, interpreting your reality in a very, very different way. Yeah, Love in the Time of Cholera. How many of you have read it? Oh, not many, but more of you will read it.
Yeah.
I would encourage you to read it. You will love the book.
I just want to ask, you're a historian, but you recommended a novel.
Yeah, I love literature. Okay. I love literature. You know, the thing about history is that, very quickly, but the thing about history is that historians tend to write for historians. And so we're engaged in all these, we argue with each other, over historical interpretations and so forth. So that's interesting at one level, and I'm invested in that. And I take great interest in that. But I do think that the life of the mind tends to be nurtured by, for me, literature. Yeah, so.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time.